Canon Fodder, episode 39. My guest this week, you know him as the Egg Nationalist. I know him as the purveyor of Man's World, a writer on InfoWars, writer in pretty much every space here, and a dear, dear friend. Ren, how are we doing?
Yeah, it's great to speak to you again. I had a really good time last time, and I've been really looking forward to this.
Most definitely. You wrote an article for InfoWars about submission right after the elections in France. And I wanted to get your take on that before we got into the novel for those who haven't read it.
Yeah, of course. So so I wrote a piece called, if I remember correctly, it was called "Submission is a Good Place to Start," and it was about it was like an introduction to the work of Michel Houellebecq for InfoWars readers. So I kind of went over, who Michel Houellebecq was and the kind of books that he's written, and the fact that he is basically a modern day literary prophet. And then I talked about the results of the French election, because the circumstances that Michel Houellebecq describes in Submission, the descent of France, or the way that France becomes an Islamic civilization or an Islamic society, the step by step, the stages that Michel Houellebecq describes, actually, we're seeing them happening now. And so, in the book, he describes how, in order to keep out Le Pen, and it is Le Pen in the book, the French left make a pact with the devil, essentially, or with Mohammed, and form a coalition that basically results in France becoming an Islamic country rather than a right-wing one.
Right. So and I think that's a pretty good overview of the novel itself. I wanted to ask your opinion, like and you might not know, but as far as how does Houellebecq have his hand to the pulse of France so thoroughly? Because it seems like you made a very detailed list of his novels and what they predicted would happen in France. And I just, does he have a crystal ball, or is he just paying very close attention?
He's made. I would say his predictions actually are not just about France; they're about the broader Western world. And I've read all of Michel Houellebecq's novels. I've read a lot of his essays, apart from his latest novel, Annihilation, which hasn't been translated into English yet, but it's coming out, I think, fairly soon. So I will read that when it comes out. I've heard it's unusually bleak even for him, actually. But so I'll go over his history of predictions. So in his second novel, Platform, which was released 2 weeks before September the 11th, 2001. He basically predicted the arrival of Islamic terrorism on the world stage as the kind of return of history. So if you think of the liberal triumphalism that's described, that's outlined or codified by Francis Fukuyama in The End of History, where he quite literally says, or appears to say, that the defeat of communism by liberal capitalism is the culmination of history in the Hegelian sense, in the sense of the Hegelian dialectic, the progress of history. Mankind has reached its apogee. It's reached a form of civilization that can't be bettered. There'll be small scale progress here and there, but there'll never be a better kind of society than a liberal capitalist democracy. That's the end of history with a capital H. Well, what Michel Houellebecq essentially does in Platform, this novel, is he shows that actually history has returned, with the arrival of Islamic terrorism as a kind of ideological force on a global scale. So the novel itself, Platform, is about, like a lot of Michel Houellebecq's novels, actually, it's about just a kind of mundane sort of middle class French chap. He's a civil servant, and he gives up his humdrum life for a life of hedonism in Southeast Asia with a woman that he meets on holiday,
Many
and they
such
basically
cases.
yeah, and they basically just become sex tourists, hedonists, and they engage in sort of more and more outlandish sort of public displays and all that kind of stuff. And then they go over to Thailand to live, and it seems like that's all the book is about. And then all of a sudden they're on the beach. I don't want to spoil the book, but all of a sudden they're on the beach and some jihadis turn up on jet skis and just start slaughtering everybody. And it's just, I mean, it's totally out of the blue. It's totally out of the blue. It's like he's describing a sex scene on this, you know, like the civil servant chap is like watching some people having sex, and then on, you know, on sun lounges, and then all of a sudden there are these jihadis killing people and blowing people's heads off, and he survives, but then he eventually he kills himself to kind of, because he can't kind of come to terms with what's happened. And that's sort of, so that was a very prophetic novel, because yeah, I mean, 2 weeks before the arrival of Islamic terrorism, on a as a global force to kind of confound the triumphal narrative of liberal progress. 2 weeks before that, the novel comes out saying that something like that's going to happen. So that was one of his big major, his first real major prediction. And he was actually taken to court. He was actually charged with a hate crime in France, I believe, for that novel and for comments that he made after its publication about Islam as a religion. Um, uh, and then the next great prediction was the prediction of submission about the Islamicization of France, and that was published on the very day of the Charlie Hebdo massacre
Yes, yes,
in
very
Paris.
very prescient of
Yeah,
him,
incredible.
and it's amazing.
One of his friends was in the Charlie Hebdo office as well. So one of his friends was killed.
Wow. I'm certain that whatever prognostication skills that he has,
Yeah.
he probably doesn't like them.
And then there's another novel recently, Serotonin, which I
Mm,
think was published in 2019, and that predicted the rise of the Gilets jaunes movement, this sort of populist movement in France. So the novel is about, in part, it's about this sort of revolt by French farmers against the central government because they're being squeezed and squeezed and pushed and pushed, and you know their livelihoods are becoming so impossible that they revolt and they take to the streets in their tractors and block the roads, and you know there's a big revolt. And that's basically what happened with the Gilets jaunes movement, which was only brought to an end actually by the coronavirus pandemic. So France was in turmoil for weeks, months. It was months actually. I mean, it was almost I think it was almost a year. It was a long time, and it looked like Macron was gonna have to resign, and the government was going to be brought down. And then the coronavirus pandemic happened. So that was another. So again, he really had his finger on the pulse there. I mean, I think Houellebecq's an interesting guy. I mean, he's very, so it's not just about France, like I say, he's thinking in civilizational terms, and I think his novels are about, they're not just about France, they're about the West.
mm,
They're about the ideology and culture of the West as a civilization, its downfall, its descent into meaningless hedonism, into unbelief and idolatry and stupidity and weakness. I mean, he's a philosophically very well informed man. I think. I mean, he's written about Schopenhauer. He wrote a book about Schopenhauer. I
yes,
think
yes. He
he's
wrote
written.
about H.P. Lovecraft as well.
Yes,
That's
yeah,
a
H.P. Love's
terrific
love
read.
too.
I recommend to anybody who knows anything about Lovecraft.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he's definitely. I mean, he is very definitely a French intellectual in that regard. Um, but yes, I think that he's a very, very keen observer of culture and of people's behavior, and I just think that he just seems to be able to see to the essence of things. I think in a way that other writers don't, and yeah, he does. If he doesn't have a crystal ball, then he's certainly got some deeper sense that most other writers lack, because for to have one novel that resonates so in such a way, with real life events, that would be more than most writers could ever ask for. But to have three, and especially submission, I think.
Hmm. And who knows, maybe Annihilation
Yeah.
will predict a few things. Hopefully not, if it's as bleak as we're being told.
Yeah, well, I think it's about somebody who is sort of having to look after his boomer parents or one
Oh
of his
dear.
boomer parents, and they're in a care home and stuff, and I think it's about like the death of Western civilization as almost embodied in the death of the boomer generation.
Mm.
I think
Well,
that's what it's about.
well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because you can see echoes of that in Submission, right?
Yeah.
It starts out Francois. He's if he is representative of, let's say, Western culture, right? Because he's a
Mm.
literature professor.
Yeah.
Yet he doesn't do anything. All he kind
No.
of does is trade off of his name and the
Mm.
fact that they can't get rid of him, as well
Yeah.
as he sleeps around with a bunch of his students. So very much this stuck
Decadent. He's a
culture.
decadent.
Yes,
He's a decadent.
yes, yes. This decadent stuck culture that at least guys on our side of Twitter and our side of let's say the political spectrum have noticed, and we realize that there needs to be a revitalization. And in some ways, Welbeck is saying that that revitalization comes through Islamic colonialism.
Mm.
Because at the end of the novel, he's got all these wives. He has a better position in life. He's if at least not made comfortable until he goes away. Francois might even learn to adopt the new culture that is being foisted on him. It's kind of left ambiguous.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he's definitely the novel is basically about, in one respect, at least with this main character, is about coming to terms with your limitations and the limit, I suppose, the limitations of action that are kind of available to people like the main character, but also the civilization itself. And so, yes, it's like the civilization needs an infusion of barbarian blood. I mean, that's a constant theme throughout Western history and throughout commentary on Western history. You know, it's in Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall
Mm,
of the Roman Empire. It's you see that with yeah, you see it in Caesar, you see it in all the way through Western history. This idea that actually, when as a theory of civilization, when a civilization becomes decadent and it is unable to sustain itself, it's unable to sustain to muster the kind of vitality that's necessary for progress and for continuity, and then something there needs to be an infusion from outside. There needs to be an invasion. There needs to be crossbreeding almost. There needs to be.
not like you could think about it even in terms of thermodynamics,
Yeah.
where one dynamic sort of space invades a sort of entropic space
Mm.
until there's until there's balance.
Yeah, 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 precisely. I mean, there are lots of different ways to think about it. I think it's a very I mean, what I like about Welbeck as well when he writes these books is that he presents situations like that and he doesn't actually necessarily tell you what he thinks.
Mm,
So I don't think that submission is necessarily I don't think that submission is necessarily a black-pilled book. So I wrote an essay actually a while ago about called Tilting at Black Pills, about the way that, well, among other things, that Welbeck is presented as this black-pilled writer. And I said, like actually, Platform, the novel that I talked about at the beginning with the jet ski riding jihadis, that's not a black-pilled novel in any sense, because actually, what it seems to suggest is that, well, that history can return. That
mm.
there can be great events in history again. History hasn't disappeared, and all we're left with it now is empty hedonism. Sitting on a beach in Thailand, drinking cocktails and sitting in the sun, and then having sex and repeating that until you die. There's actually the possibility of something else, even if it's only explosions and blood and death, and like there's history is still taking place. So, I mean, with submission, I don't think that necessarily that Welbeck is saying this is necessary or this is definitely going to happen. But I think that what he's doing is he's describing a particular class of person who stands as a kind of symbol for the broader society or a broader influential segment of French society,
Mm,
and a segment of the elite in particular that is. And then he's describing, what would they actually do in a situation like this? Well, I tell you what they'll do. They'll come to terms with it. They'll rationalize it, and they'll find a place for themselves where they feel comfortable. And that's precisely what the main character does. He doesn't resist these. He's uncomfortable. He's made uncomfortable by the Islamicization of France, and his girlfriend in maybe the sort of most poignant section of the novel. He has an Israeli girlfriend, a
mhm.
Jewish girlfriend, and she says that she's going to leave France because it's becoming more and more hostile, because it's becoming more and more Islamic, anti-Semitic, and she says, I have to go to Israel. I'm going to Israel, and then he says, very poignantly, well, for the European people, there is no Israel. We only have
Yes.
Europe. There's nowhere else for us to go. And so, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think that what Welbeck is doing is he's describing the cowardice
Mm.
of a particular segment, a decisive segment of French and I think by extension European society as well.
It's a kind of call to action by displaying what inaction looks like and the
Yeah, yeah,
consequences of inaction.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I don't think it's Welbeck saying, "Oh, this is the future of France." Definitely, this is exactly what's going to happen. It's like this is what could happen. This is how people plausibly would behave. Certain, segments like university professors, members of the bureaucracy, the cultural elite, etc.
It's very interesting. I know only a handful of Frenchmen from my days at university, but not a lot of French frogs, which is
Hmm.
kind of ironic. And I wanted to know because obviously geographically you're a bit closer to there. Is it really just a language thing? Is it there that they just don't want to engage with Anglo Twitter? Is there are these discussions being had in France, or do you think it's completely void?
Yeah, I'm sure these discussions are. I mean, Michel Houellebecq is France's greatest living novelist by far. I mean, I think he is a cultural force, and the appearance of a new Michel Houellebecq novel is always a huge cultural event. Sometimes, often attended with quite significant controversy, like Platform when he was actually. Uh, prosecuted, and there was a huge furore about submission as well, and there was a certain amount with Serotonin. I don't know what the reception of the latest one has been like, but at the very least, I can say that it's a big thing when Michel Houellebecq releases a novel. So, I mean, I speak to a few French people on Twitter. There's a chap called Pascal Emmanuel Gobry,
Mm.
who I talk to, who you may be familiar with, Peg. He's a really cool dude. Uh, and his mother is actually, I think, is a politician under Le Pen for the national rally. Um, uh, so yeah, I mean, I think that these are discussions that are going on across the West. I think, and but obviously in France, in particular, then these Welbeck novels are about France. Submission could equally be about England, though it could equally be about the UK, could be about Germany. Although there are different dynamics at work. Like if you were to look at Germany, you've got the Holocaust, you've got the World War II, and the very painful, the very deep sense of shame that the German people feel about their recent past. I mean, I had a German girlfriend, and she told me what it was like at school to be taught history, and the relentless focus on Germany's crimes in the over the last 100 years. It creates a certain sense of national guilt, and a kind of want, a desire to atone for the past. And I mean, that's very evident in the behavior and the utterances of someone like Angela Merkel, who
Mm.
very openly said, Germany, to atone for its past, needs to be Europe's conscience. And so that's why she took the lead with the migrant crisis in 2015, saying, wir schaffen das, we can take it, come, as many as want to come should come. And she decided on her own the fate of the continent, basically, and millions of people came. 1 million people came to Germany, and millions came across the continent as a whole. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, like I say, these Houellebecq novels are novels about European civilization. The specific details in Germany or England or Spain or Italy may be slightly different, but I think on a civilizational level, this is the kind of fundamental. He's asking fundamental questions. He's getting to the root of things, and obviously demographic change. That's the central context of the novel submission, is demographic change. It's only possible for there to be an Islamic government in France because of demographic change. France becomes an Islamic nation democratically, in a sense, through this process of coalition making that's been going on for decades and decades to keep the right wing out of power. It just, because of demographic change now in the novel, in I think it's 2022 or 2021 when it actually happens, the pace of demographic change means that the coalition now is not just leftist parties, it's leftist parties and a growing Islamic party, it's called the Muslim Brotherhood, actually, in the
Hmm.
book. And that's the decisive change. It's the same old political behavior. It's the same old political horseplay and tricks to keep the right wing out, even though the right wing are the most popular. Le Pen is the most popular politician, and her party is the most popular party in France in the book, as it is today. But through this horseplay, through these coalitions, because of demographic change, then France ends up as an Islamic nation instead of a right-wing one.
And it's amazing to me to think that this system was set up basically by de Gaulle in order to keep out the socialists and the communists, only for them to, uh, that long march through the institutions that we always
Yes.
talk about, really has just taken hold. And unfortunately, the right, at least in France, and definitely, I guess, in Europe in general, with their parliamentary systems, haven't quite figured out how to play the game. And it seems like we're running out of time to learn how.
Yes. Yeah. Well, this is the thing. I mean, the long march through the institutions, I think, is the fundamental. It's the fundamental key to understanding the success of the left over the last 100 years. The subversion of institutions, from the capture and subversion of institutions from within. It's clever. It's simple, but they've been doing it for so long that they've built such a power base in the key institutions of society that actually I mean, I don't know whether I don't think that there's actually space for the right to do that itself. The right needs to capture institutions. The right needs to wield institutional power, but we don't have 100 years in order to infiltrate leftist institutions, subvert them, and then swing the pendulum back. That's just, we don't have that time. I mean, I think that we're getting to a point, actually, where across the Western world, leftist governments are trying to do away with democracy and to institute forms of leftist totalitarian rule, as they did in the 20th century in the Soviet Union and or in Russia and elsewhere. So
I think that's the worst thing that they could do.
mm,
Personally, I think that would, as soon as there is no longer a political solution, you're or even the guise of a political solution, because there hasn't really been a political solution since what, turn of the century. Uh,
mm.
as soon as that no longer exists, you're basically you're declaring open war rather than this sort of covert war that is being uh, waged right now.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I kind of flip flop a bit about whether there will be a civil war and whether the right will fight effectively or not. I mean, it is true, for instance, in the US that the right has most of the guns, and most of the military people are right, etc. Um, but then you see things like that the importation of mass migration, demographic replacement, is taking place not just among the general populace, but it's also being used in institutions like the military. So they're clearing out not only in the not only are they clearing out right wingers from the positions of authority in the chain of command, but they're also importing huge numbers of Hispanics into the Marine
Hmm.
Corps and the Army and the Air Force, and so it's kind of it's a bit of a Roman Empire situation in many respects, I think. But sometimes I'm much more optimistic, and I think, well, actually, uh, the institutions that matter in a situation like that, like the military, the police force, are likely to come out um, against some kind of leftist takeover. I don't know, but I do think fundamentally that we are headed in that direction, and I think we're headed in that direction pretty soon. Actually, like, I mean, in the US, then who knows what's going to happen? They just tried to blow Donald Trump's head off at a rally in front of the world,
Yeah.
and they've just replaced Biden in a kind of Soviet style coup. I mean, we don't even know if Biden is still alive at this point. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, who knows what's going to happen before the election? I mean, we've got 3 months. We've got 12 weeks to the election. I mean, that's a lot of time.
My friend the Prudentialist is want to say it's only July.
Yeah,
We have months until this all
yeah,
shakes out, and then the
yeah.
rest of our lives.
Well, yeah, because I mean, you'd think, okay, well, if they're going to assassinate Donald Trump, then they'll do it just before the election. But
Mm.
no, this is 12 weeks before the election. So, where do you, if you're going to try and stop Donald Trump being president, where do you go from there? I mean, do you drop a bomb on one of his rallies?
It really
What do
does
you
feel like
do?
they need to escalate in order
Mm,
to achieve what they are looking for,
yeah, yeah,
which is scary to think about. I did
yes, it
want
is.
to pivot back to the book slightly, right?
Mm,
Whenever I am scrolling Twitter and I see feeds out of France, right? Whenever there's rioting, it's always for pensions. It's always for sort of or the football team won,
mm,
or there's some ethnic grievance, but never for a priest being beheaded or children being
no,
assaulted. And Welbeck definitely in the novel you don't see any of that either. You don't see any sort
no.
of ascendancy from the normal French people about
Mm,
their situation. In fact, they kind of go meekly along with it,
yes,
which you know he's again, his prognostication skills are unbeaten.
yeah.
Do
Well,
you think?
I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I think he says in the novel that there are sort of he kind of gestures towards these sort of isolated incidents of violence,
Mm,
and says that there's some sporadic attempts to fight back, but there's nothing organized. There isn't a civil war.
and much like I forget who wrote it, but in the Camp of the Saints, which
Yeah,
when I read,
Jean Raspail.
yes, very very similar. There's no great there's no great pushback from
No.
the native people of France, the French, and the best people can do is sort of mount resistance from Switzerland, and even that's sort of that's thought of as not going to work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I again, like you say, I mean, I think that that's a very, very astute. Um, it's a very, very astute, penetrating kind of insight into the dynamics of protest in France and resistance in France. Because, yeah, I mean, the French do like to protest a lot. You see
Hmm.
it, and the Gilets jaunes thing. I mean, they were protesting about the standard of living, about the economy, etc. But actually, Yeah, it's there's definitely a noticeable difference between, people mass mobilization about pension schemes, and where was the mass mobilization after the Charlie Hebdo stuff,
We got a Twitter we got a Twitter phrase, je suis Charlie. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had these candlelight vigils and sort of people saying, "Oh, no to hate," and we need to, we need to.
It's almost like mass Islamic violence is a kind of weather event, like this tragic
Mm,
earthquake or
sure.
tsunami that there's no responsible party. All we can do is come together and try and heal and rebuild.
Well, this is an interesting thing actually that I've written about in other contexts. Um, there's a playbook. There's a government playbook
Yep. Yep.
that's been deployed certainly across the Anglosphere, but I think also more broadly in Europe, called the British name for it is controlled spontaneity. There was a Middle East Eye essay about it, a very interesting essay about it a few years ago, controlled spontaneity. And basically, there were riots in the UK in 2010, 2011, and they really took the government by surprise. And the Conservative government was really, really, really worried by them because they happened seemingly out of nowhere and on a large scale across multiple cities in the UK, rioting, looting, thousands and tens of thousands of people were involved. And the government was very worried that something like that might happen again. And there were also worries about terrorism as well, because we had the July the 7th bombings in
Mm.
2005 in London when Islamic terrorists blew up buses and tube trains and killed 50 odd people and maimed hundreds. So there was this sort of growing worry about sort of mass casualty events and riots, and the Olympics were coming up. The 2012 Olympics were coming up as well, and so what the government did was they came up with this scheme to direct public opinion and emotion, mass behavior in the event of a terrorist attack or a national tragedy or any kind of event that had the potential to elicit widespread, potentially dangerous outpourings of public sentiment. And they came up with this thing called controlled spontaneity, where they had in plan they had in place all of these plans to, like deploy special hashtags on social media to get people to, instead of having angry thoughts, to to look towards reconciliation and love and friendship and
Don't look back in anger was one,
what.
right?
Yeah, yeah. So that was after the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017 or 19, whenever that was. Yeah, don't look back in anger. That was controlled spontaneity in action, right? It's like, yes, these children have been blown up by an Islamic terrorist, but actually we all need to come together and we need to have candlelight vigils and do social media posts, and we'll all sing this Oasis song about not looking, don't look back in anger, etc. That's controlled spontaneity. I mean, it's crowd control.
Mm.
But it's done it's in a very sophisticated way. I mean, you can see it that it's happening. When you know what it is, you can see it every time. But it is done in a sophisticated way with social media and with the connivance of the mainstream media, and like they put on flash mobs of people handing out pamphlets with like a warm fuzzy message so that people don't feel angry, and they would actually set up, or not false flags, but they would choreograph fake events that demonstrate the power of love and reconciliation, and you know um like, I think, what was it, during the sort of BLM, the Summer of Floyd thing, then uh there was sort of agitation in London, and there was this high profile event where a BLM protester rescued a shaven-headed white nationalist thug from a crowd, and it was shown everywhere. This image of this black man all dressed in black, carrying this like white nationalist thug out from a crowd because he'd had a heart attack or something. It
Mm.
turned out that the BLM man, in inverted commas, was actually an actor, was a paid actor. And so this was a staged event that made it into all of the newspapers. It was on the television, etc., designed to promote racial reconciliation. But it was totally staged, and so that's part of it as well. I mean, it's a complicated thing, and that maybe that aspect of it doesn't necessarily come out in submission, perhaps as much as just the sort of kind of naked politicking that goes on in France to
Hmm.
prevent the far right. But actually, there are definitely more subtle things going on, more sinister things going on to shape public opinion and prevent people from basically waking up about the situation that they're in.
Now, perhaps we're not there yet, right? But from what I see of the quote unquote new French that are arriving,
Mm,
they do not have the acumen to organize something like the Muslim Brotherhood in the novel.
mm.
What seems more likely and more pernicious, in my opinion, is that it is this sort of this sort of they're being used by the centrist and leftist parties
Yes,
as kind of attack dogs
sure.
rather than Welbeck almost gives them too much credit in thinking that they have any kind of agency, and again that this might just we just might not be there yet. There
Well, I
might
mean,
be a Muslim Brotherhood party
what
next
we're
year,
seeing
2 years from now.
Yeah, so what we're seeing, so let's I'll talk a little bit about Britain actually. So what we see in Britain, what we're starting to see in Britain now is the emergence of uh, dedicated Islamic political interests. So in the last election, 5 single issue independent Islamic independent MPs representing the interests of Islam were elected, and they were all elected off the back of anger at the Labour Party's stance on Gaza, basically. So there are 5. I mean, it's a small number. 5 out of 660 MPs are now basically single issue Islamic MPs who were elected because of Gaza. But traditionally, yes, in the UK and I would imagine in France too, then these new immigrant groups have been represented by the traditional left that once upon a time represented the working classes, that was broadly socialist or even Marxist. And what they've done is they have abandoned their traditional constituencies, the white working classes, the native European working classes, and sort of thrown in their lot with the with the foreign immigrants who are surging, they're increasing in numbers, etc. Um, so yes, I mean that's a good point that you make. Actually, I think about the way that the political interests or the political representation rather that these Islamic and immigrant groups get. It doesn't. It's yeah. In the actual situation is quite different. I think in France and in the UK and in Germany and in elsewhere. I mean, it's generally traditional leftist groups pivoting away from their traditional constituencies and coming instead to represent these new Europeans, these immigrants instead. So yeah, I mean, the degree to which there is a kind of Islamic masterminding of these processes is debatable. And yes, I mean the central figure behind the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood in submission, is a chap called Mohammed Ben Abbas,
Hmm.
who is presented as being. I mean, he's Islamic. He's an immigrant or the son of an immigrant, and he is very smart and very politically astute, and he creates this movement and he makes it presentable, and he plays down the sort of jihad elements and the elements of sort of aggressive expansionism that we associate with Islam and its relationship to other religions, and he makes Islam politically acceptable so that he can get into power. And I don't actually see that there's much evidence of that sort of thing going on.
In fact, you could say that if such a thing were to occur,
Mm,
the secret services, the intelligence agencies would probably be the only time they would act, because one would think that those kinds of actors would have ties to Iran, would have ties to
mm,
groups that have access to a lot of capital, uh, whose goals are against what even the most far left French or European
mm.
political parties are going after.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, I mean, there is dirty money, or there is Islamic money coming into the West that is being used to pay for Islamic. That's being used to pay for mosques and places of worship, but also for university departments and endowments and all sorts of stuff. And there is definitely, I think, behind a lot of that a deliberate aim to Islamicize the West, absolutely. But yeah, at the level of political parties, then it's definitely not reached that stage. I don't know that an openly Islamic party could campaign um, in the UK or in Germany or France, despite the level of demographic change. I mean, these independent MPs who were elected in the recent general election in Britain, they were all, you know, elected in local areas where the population is more or less entirely Muslim. You
Mm.
know, these they are local, um, they're local single issue um, members of parliament. They're not representing any kind of Islamic agenda on a national scale. You know, there's no linking up between them or anything like that. I mean, they may very well cut deals during this current parliament with the leftists to help them, you know, get through crucial measures in parliament, etc. But it's not coordinated in the way that Michel Houellebecq describes in the book. Now, it could be that there is a demographic tipping point at which all of a sudden it just happens. You know, I wouldn't discount that possibility at all. It could be the case that, you know, once Muslims come to be 25% or 30% of the population in a country in Europe, that all of a sudden they actually openly start to form political associations and parties that are openly Islamic, that openly um, campaign for Islamicization measures in a way that that leftist parties wouldn't be able to do, that mainstream native parties wouldn't be able to do.
But at the same time, we see that there's a power to the branding of
Mm,
established parties like the
yes.
Tories or like Labor. So it would be easier to just infiltrate the what is already established and shift the platform
Mm,
rather than kind of do something new. I think you'll see those upstarts, those five sort of single issue communities. They might hold their seat for a little bit, but they'll what Labor, what the Tories might do is just install a candidate who is like that guy, but
mm.
with a L or with a conservative pin on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's safe to say that the situation that Welbeck describes in the novel, while being extremely plausible, and he actually has made, you know, substantial predictions that have come true. I think that the situation is going to be different, and obviously the time frame is going to be different too, because the novel was written in 2015, and I think it begins in 2017, and then France is an Islamic nation in 2022 or 2021. I think we're going to have to look decades into the future, maybe 20, 30 years. And things absolutely, I think, will be different. Things will be different because not only because things will be different across Europe. I think that's the context as well that's sort of missing from the novel, and that deserves some consideration. Is actually, how does there's a big right-wing revival taking place across Europe right now, and it's actually taking place in the UK of all places as well, which is interesting. And that doesn't feature in submission either. As part of the prediction, a broader right-wing revival across the entire continent, and what that might mean. Within, say, the European Union, but also just among the nations of the European Union and of Europe more broadly. So I think that there's, again, I don't think that we should see. I mean, we should see submission for what it is. We should definitely recognize the prophetic nature of the book. It is a prophetic book, and Michel Houellebecq himself is a prophet. And he's got a lot of things right, and I think he's nailed down fundamental aspects of the establishment, of the French establishment, its cowardice, its willingness to accommodate the unthinkable, or what was once unthinkable, to make its peace with it. But actually, I think that it's not some ironclad prophecy. I actually think that there are things going on that suggest that actually anything could happen, that we can't really predict exactly what's going to happen simply on the basis of current demographics.
I kind of want to end it there on a note of hope. I also realize that you have to get going soon. So, Ren, where can people find you? How can they support your work? And yeah.
Well, yeah, no, it's good to end on a hopeful note. I try to do that in my podcast too when I can. So you can follow me on Twitter, babygravy9. Mansworldmag.online is where you can find my magazine, Man's World, and you can get physical copies from passage.press. I have Substack, that's raweggstack.com. And that's those are the main places you should go to. I mean, my Twitter, always always the latest updates on Twitter, and there are links in my bio there if you forget any of the links I've just mentioned. So yeah, follow me on Twitter. That's the main place that you should go.
And we'll make sure to put those links in the show notes below.
Thank you.
As
It's
for
been a pleasure.
Oh,
pleasure.
most definitely. The pleasure is all mine, and I'm sure the listeners feel the same way. As for the Double Dealer, you know where to find us, doubledealer.substack.com. You can follow us at DBLDealer. If you want to support us, you can buy a magazine, you can subscribe to our Substack, you can become a paid subscriber and get your own episode of Canon Fodder. On Terrible at Ending Podcasts, we'll just say insert ending